for our last talk of 2024 is Nellie McKesson. And I asked her if she had any fun hobbies to share, and she said she's really into sewing. So please do what I did and admire the gorgeous construction of her dress, which she made. Look at that. It's beautiful. Good fabric. It is good everything. She also comes from the book publishing world, and she's going to share information about just her experiences working with all kinds of writers in every capacity. I'm so excited to hear her share about making things make semantic sense.
Thank you. All right. Thank you guys so much for sticking it out to the end with me. As they said, I come from book publishing. But I am a developer, specifically a toolchain developer. So what I do is I take people's words and I do magic things and get them out into the world in whatever format they need to be out there in. So today we're going to talk about semantics, always very exciting. Here's my outline for our talk. We're going to talk about what in the world this is and why do we care about it, and then we're going to talk about how you can approach this. Okay, so the what and the why. Before I dive too deeply in, I want to make it clear that I'm not going to be giving you guys a list of tools that you should use or super specific workflows that everybody needs to have. This kind of stuff, it differs between every single team and every single organization. So I'm going to instead try and give you some context around what's really important when you're working with this kind of thing, and then some questions that you can ask as you try to implement it on your team. Okay, so semantics. In its most general sense, semantics just means the meaning of things. When we're talking about presenting content to people, what I'm talking about when I say semantics is the way that things are labeled. So what is a heading? What is a paragraph? What is an aside or a box? And these kinds of labels help to tell us how a whole document fits together. Okay, so let's look at this example here. When you look at this, if you have good vision, you can probably make some inferences about what these different things are. So you can see, like, there's some bigger, bolder text, probably a heading. There's some text in a box. That's probably some sort of aside or a note or something. There's some numbered text, a numbered list. And that's great. You know, we're human beings. We're very visual. But now try and extract your vision away from this. So what about people who have trouble with sight, or maybe computers who can't see? How would you make those same inferences about this text? So you're taking away all of those design elements, basically, and you're just left with the text itself. Now, sure, you could read the design instructions. That would be a really tedious process to say, oh, okay, I can see that this has a design instruction of 16 points in bold, so maybe that's a heading, but I have to compare it to every other design instruction. Computers can do this okay, people less so. This is also a pretty unscalable process. So for example, for that example text, what I did was I wrote the text. Someone else wrote the text and I stole it. I applied the design formatting individually to each piece of text. But then what if there's some new branding or something, and I need to make my text match these new branding rules? Then I have to go through and reapply that individually to every single paragraph again. So the first suggestion, you could call it a rule. I'm not a big fan of rules, more suggestions. But semantics should exist separately from design. What does that mean? That means that we are taking that semantic information, those labels, And we are applying them as labels rather than as design instructions. So we have our labels here. We have our level 1 heading, body text, aside, very clear labels, unmistakable what these things are meant to be. These are things that would live in the background of your text. So they'll live in your markup, and we'll talk about markup in a minute. And they're things where design can help you apply your labels, and that's another thing that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But design is not the goal. The goal is having the semantic labeling information so that everyone who's interacting with this content, be they sighted, non-sighted, computers, they all read the content the same way. If you've ever done any kind of web design, this is sounding very familiar to you. Web design works exactly the same way, where you're separating your content from your design. You have your content as HTML, you have your design as CSS, and you put those together to present them to your users. So it's time to dive into markup. It's hard to talk about this stuff to such a wide audience. So some of you, this might be really basic information, but I guarantee there's someone out there who hears these words thrown around but doesn't really know what they mean, and so this part is for you. So if you are doing any kind of writing in a digital format, you already work with markup. Pretty much every digital writing tool is some kind of markup in the background. So this is my Google Doc of my talk proposal. And then in the background, that's just HTML. I'd say the majority of authoring tools these days are built on HTML for many reasons. This is another example of document markup. So this is actually a Microsoft Word document. Yes, that is also markup in the background. This is their XML. It's very ugly, but it's also very consistent and structured. So just another example of that markup is everywhere. So a few side-by-side markup examples. At the top, we have some HTML, and then some XML, and then some ASCII doc, which is sort of a light markup language. Semantic labeling is already an inherent part of any markup language. It's really the crux of what makes markup work. That said, not all markup is semantically correct. HTML especially can be a terrible offender for this. If you think about the rules for accessible HTML content, so any accessible website, there are some very specific rules about how that content needs to be marked up so that non-sighted users can navigate it. This involves things like these specific tags that you're using. You have to use section tags, make sure you're using the correct heading tags, all of that. I'm not going to dive too deeply into this, but I do want to give you some examples of what real semantically correct HTML looks like. That said, do you need to be tagging semantic HTML for all of your writing? No, of course not. There's a point of separation here that needs to happen where there's the content that you write, and then there's the content that users see. And those are not always the same thing. Especially if we're talking about workflows where you're publishing to multiple different endpoints. So for example, maybe you're making PDFs and websites, or ebooks and websites, or all three, or something else entirely. A lot of those things require different markup as their input. And that if you're having to code that markup every time, that makes your job harder because then you have to write 3 different things. So instead, what you do is you write once, and you publish everywhere with some conversions. So what you want to do here, so we're kind of getting into the world of single source workflows, which go hand in hand with semantics and markup and all of this stuff. So what happens is you tag your source content as you're writing with some kind of labeling scheme, which is going to be the second half of this talk. You introduce some automation so that that source content gets converted into the different other markups that are needed for all of your output formats. And when it comes to that writing, there are so many options. Like I said, markup is everywhere. It's driving pretty much every single writing tool out there. So as long as your tool is creating some kind of markup, you can hook into those conversions and export your endpoints, your output files, just using some automation built on that markup. Okay, so our second suggestion, semantic labels should be clear and consistent. So that's what powers all of that automation. Computers look at this clear list of semantic labels and know, okay, I know that this level 1 heading label should always be mapped to an H1 element in the website, and it should be mapped to whatever else in this other endpoint. So we're really getting into the how now. How do we apply these labels? How do you introduce this kind of automation onto your team? Again, this is a very unspecific flow here. I'm doing my best not to say, use this tool, use this exact workflow, but in general, this is a workflow that works for most people. You have your authoring tool. From your authoring tool, you go to some sort of more structured markup, and then from there, you go to your endpoints. Okay, so here are the things that we're going to walk through for how to apply this. First, you have to know what your endpoints are. You have to know what your input points are, who your authors are, what kind of technical resources you have, and what your budget is, of course. So the first question is your content already semantically accurate? This is something that you would evaluate by looking at your output content and your input content and seeing, am I using labels? Are my labels clear and consistent? Am I using them exactly the same way in every single document? And if the answer is yes, then awesome, you're good to go. If the answer is no, then you can start asking some of these questions. So the first one is understanding your endpoints. Endpoints means the things that your users are interacting with. So is it a website? Is it a PDF, an ebook, something else? And the questions you need to ask here are, first of all, do any of these endpoints require a very specific markup already? So for example, maybe your web design team already created some really intricate designs based on a specific markup that they are expecting to come out of your writing. Will they be open to changing that? Is that expected markup already pretty good or not? And these are all questions that you need to ask for every single one of your endpoints. Another question to ask is there a solution that can work for all of your endpoints? Or do you need to think about some different routes depending on the complexity of what those different endpoints are? Okay, very important. Who is doing the writing? You got to think about the size of your team. So how many people are writing? How many people does that mean that you need to retrain? That's actually a pretty big effort. You guys are documentarians. You know how hard it is to convey this kind of information to everyone. And then how technically competent are these writers? Can they write markup? Do they need a more visual GUI tool? An extremely important caveat here, you never want anyone to be coding HTML or XML. There is so much room for error when you do that. Speaking from experience, as someone who, a developer who was asked to mark up some content myself, I decided to go rogue, and I coded it with a bunch of random HTML elements that I wanted to use to make my content look a really specific way. And of course, this was completely unreplicatable and not supported by any of the toolchain, and I wrote my own things for it. And it created this big outlier in all of the processes and workflows that the team then had to work around forever. It's also really easy to mess up markup, so forget ending tags, use the wrong tags, any myriad of problems that could be introduced, misspell tags. So it's just something you want to avoid completely. Okay, so that said, that doesn't mean writing markup is impossible. There are some things called light markup languages. Markdown and AsciiDoc are the two big ones. You've probably heard of them. So here we have some AsciiDoc right next to some HTML of the same content. And you can kind of see, if you've never seen AsciiDoc before, you can see that it's a lot simpler than the HTML content. And you can probably imagine that it's a lot easier to write as a human being. The funny thing about these languages is that even though they look a lot simpler, they're actually much more strict in terms of authoring. So there are some rules baked into AsciiDoc and Markdown specifically that say, headings must use these equal sign delimiters for AsciiDoc, and they must come in a specific order, and if you don't have them in that order, it's going to give you a bunch of warnings or errors. Your converted content is probably going to look differently than you expect. So it kind of builds in some linting or validation into your process without you really having to do anything. So a workflow built around some light markup might look like this. So you might have your AsciiDoc as what your authors are writing. And then you have a conversion to HTML, which is a much more highly structured markup. The great thing about AsciiDoc and Markdown is that there are a bunch of open source pre-existing tools to do these conversions for you. So you don't have to pay anyone to develop this. It exists out of the box. It's really well maintained. And then, of course, once you get your HTML, you can go wherever you need to go. Okay, so the next question is understanding your input points. So this is generally your authoring tool. So on your team, what tools are you using right now? Does that tool support this kind of semantic labeling? If it does not, how hard is it going to be to move away from this tool? Oops. Okay, so talking about tools, talking about your labels, getting your labels into your tool. The first thing to do, of course, is create your label set. If you are creating all of this from scratch, so if you're not using, for example, the standard output from converting AsciiDoc to HTML or something, and you're just creating your own schema, then you're essentially creating two things. You're creating your set of labels for your authors to use, and you're creating a full structured markup schema. So that's that HTML or that XML or whatever that intermediary point is. There are, again, some tools that combine those two things. So for example, ASCII Doctor, which is the conversion tool for ASCII Doc, it has its preset HTML output that you'd be using, so you probably wouldn't create a full HTML schema if you were going that route. You just need to create whatever customizations you need for your ASCII Doc workflow. Important to think about here, what kind of conversion options do you have? So again, when you're thinking about that jump point between your authored content with the more simple labels to your full markup schema, if you have access to toolchain developers or scripters of some sort who can help you create those conversions, that's great, and that probably means that you can create your own schema and go that route. If you don't, you might want to look for a tool where that kind of thing is built in. So again, here is Google Docs. They have some labels. They are extremely basic. I pretty much never recommend Google Docs as an input tool for anybody, except myself, of course. So when you're thinking about your tool and your labels, they kind of inform each other. So you want to try and pick a tool that will let you use whatever custom labels you need to use, so something relatively customizable. That said, every team is going to have some constraints about what tool they use. So whichever tool you end up picking is also probably going to inform your set of labels that you're creating. If you're not sure if your tool supports this, just ask somebody. You can email a developer or one of the technical folks on your team. Some terminology to use. Styles is what they call it in Word and Google Docs. Classes in HTML. One of those words will probably help people figure out what you're trying to talk about. Okay, so a set of labels. Here's an example of a set of semantic labels. This is a set that I actually created for myself. You can see that I added a prefix to every single label. That's because this is a set of labels in a Microsoft Word file. Microsoft Word actually has built-in labels that they already use, so I wanted to distinguish my labels from their labels, so I added this prefix to make it really clear, these are my labels that I want to use. You want to make sure that you have a label for every type of element that you're using, and yes, that can mean a lot of labels. There are some ways to use conversions to make that list of labels smaller. I'm not going to get into the specifics of that right now, but feel free to ask me if you want those tips. So again, here's that same Microsoft Word file that's using that semantic label set. This is where design can kind of help you with adoption with your authors. So if your authors know to expect that, headings should look this way, code blocks should be surrounded by these green bars, that sort of thing, it can help them just visually know whether they're creating their labeled content correctly or not. Of course, as always, you have to think about your vision-impaired authors. I actually don't know how these labels interact with screen readers. I've never tested that with Microsoft Word or other tools. And I'm hoping that Microsoft has, but it's a good thing to look into. Okay, so once you have your labels, you move on to your full schema. Again, that's those rules about your HTML. So you're using section tags, you're using heading tags, you're using specific classes or roles. Again, this is only something you have to do if you're building a complete tool chain end to end. I always recommend at least basing your schema on something that already exists and taking cues from that. A couple of examples here. There's actually an educational markup schema created by the people who created the EPUB spec, which is the type of file that ebooks are. They put so much work into creating that spec, so it would be pretty silly to start from scratch and recreate that. Similarly with XML, there's DocBook, super established schema for marking up content. Okay, so a summary. You have your labels that your writers are adding as they're writing in this authoring tool. You have a conversion that goes to your full structured markup that uses your schema. And then from there, you have more conversions to your endpoints. A couple more things to look at. Again, understanding your access to technical resources. This is going to determine how much custom stuff you can add to your tool chain, so how much conversion work you can include, or whether you need to go with a established tool that already has this stuff built in. Who's going to create these scripts, who's going to maintain these scripts, who's going to fix things when they break, because things are always going to break, and then who's going to answer questions for your authors. And finally, budget. Again, can you hire people to write these scripts? If you don't have that kind of budget, do you need to use open source or out-of-the-box tools? There are plenty of those. Can you afford to pay a monthly subscription for an out-of-the-box tool that does all this for you? If so, how much can you afford? All the questions that the business people like you to ask. Okay, and then just getting into a few examples of specific tool chains that I've seen people use that do all this. So this is an AsciiDoc-based tool chain. This is actually what I built for the team at Raspberry Pi. So what they do is they write AsciiDoc just in a code editor. All of that goes onto GitHub. It then goes into a Jekyll-based workflow. So Jekyll is an open source tool that can take these kinds of light markup content and just turn it into a website. It works so well. I love it. So Jekyll turns their AsciiDoc into HTML and then puts it right on the web. And that is exactly what is powering the Raspberry Pi documentation that you see when you load it up. Okay, so this is a Microsoft Word-based toolchain. I know I keep talking about Microsoft Word. Unfortunately, there are way too many people in the world who still will only use Microsoft Word for writing. So it's something that I've been forced to use a lot. So this is a fully custom toolchain that I built for a book publisher. In this one, they have Microsoft Word as their input with that custom set of labels. It then goes through some custom Python scripts, which output this HTML schema, and then more custom Python scripts to create their endpoint files. This one is much more expensive to implement than the previous one because it has so much custom scripting, and the previous one was pretty much all open source tools. Okay, and then this is what a platform-based toolchain would look like. So this is, if you're just using an app out of the box, you're authoring directly in this app with their label set, hopefully customizable. The app does a bunch of magical stuff in the background, and out comes your output formats. This one is usually the lowest bar in terms of technical expertise, but also usually requires relatively high author buy-in because you're foisting a new platform on your authors. All of these are going to require some author buy-in. But anytime you're choosing a new tool, there was a talk earlier today about how they built their own tool at, I think it was Stripe. And they had to like talk to all the different stakeholders, get all the buy-in, and make this magical super tool that worked for everybody. Okay, so that is the whirlwind version of creating a toolchain based on clean, consistent semantic labeling. It's a huge, huge topic, so I really tried to distill it down to 30 minutes. But that said, there's so much more that we could say about it. Feel free to send me questions. I'm always happy to talk about the different ways that I've approached this. And here is my wonderful cat. Okay, thank you.
These are so high.
Yeah.
Nellie, thank you so much for your talk. What a cool intersection between the language we all think about every day, but also the structure that most people who are using the docs never think about,
Right.
and scalability, which is so cool because a lot of the time when you hear about these best practices, you know that you should do them, but then you don't actually know how to make it happen
Yes.
for the huge code base that you have.
Yes. Yeah, it's really a variety of different languages, English, but then also
Yeah.
semantics and HTML and whatever else, which are all languages.
Yeah, and all of those things intersect with meaning in totally
Yeah.
different ways. It was really cool to see the way that you drew relationships between those things. Yeah. So our first question is from somebody who has a huge doc site to clean up for semantic structure. You're talking about best practices, but which ones that you covered would you prioritize first, just to get the most value out of your time that you
Oh,
have?
that's such a great question. I would say the first thing to do, especially if you're working with an existing repository of documents, is putting together that label set and applying it to everything. Once you have that, you can kind of go any direction from there. You can do scripting, you can port it into an app or something, but that's really the crux of building a scalable and future-proofed archive.
Great, thank you. Douglas says, I think you said HTML is especially bad at being semantically correct. Can you expand on that?
Yes. Okay, it's not necessarily bad. Let me clarify. Humans can use it the wrong way and make it not semantically correct. So especially if you're thinking about the presentational format, so the website that your users are seeing, it is absolutely possible, and many people do, just use paragraph tags for everything, and then in your CSS, say, oh, paragraph with class of heading should be, styled bigger or whatever. And that is bad. That's the wrong way to do semantics, because it doesn't tell the vision impaired people anything. They can't see that this is an H1 tag, and it doesn't really tell computers anything.
Which leads really nicely into our next question. Someone works with somebody who makes beautiful InDesign files, but like you said, that structure is missing. So
Yes.
if it's not maybe immediately visible in somebody's deliverables, how do you ask them or convince them that they need to follow the semantic structure?
Okay, this is one of the hardest questions. One of the strategies to use is to stress accessibility. That's one of those magic words that everyone knows is important. A lot of people don't totally know the specifics of what it entails, but they know that they can get in trouble if they don't do it. So if you tell them, for accessibility purposes, we need you to use InDesign styles. We can help you put together an InDesign style set if you need us to, but we need you to use those consistently. That might help you convince them.
Yeah, absolutely. We have some interest in what you said about semantic labels. So we have one person asking you to expand on why they're so important as the sort of the foundation of those edits, and another question about how do you know which labels to choose and apply?
Okay, two great questions. First, why are they so important? So again, accessibility. So these labels are what are being used to map your authored content to these output formats. So whatever is happening in between your writing and the website or wherever your words are ending up, it needs some kind of instruction from you to know, I need to take this paragraph and actually turn it into a heading. I need to take this block of text and actually mark it as an aside that's not part of the content flow. And that's what these labels do. That's the entire purpose of them. So in terms of knowing which labels to apply, that is kind of up to you and your team. So like I said, the first thing that you would do is put together your list of labels that covers all of your different pieces of content. So you'll have your chapter titles, your generic heading maybe, box content, notes, all of that sort of thing. And then as you're doing this, you first have to make sure that your team all buys into using these labels consistently, consistency. Hopefully your tool will have some way to give your writers visual cues about which labels they're using. Again, this is another place where design can come in handy, because if you say, if you make sure that box content is always highlighted green, for example, then as your authors are writing, if they have a box and it's not highlighted green, they know, oh, that's wrong. I need to use the correct label for this.
So it sounds like something you'd also want to standardize with a style guide and stuff like that.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, which leads into a question about parallels with your work in publishing. So it'd be cool to hear you talk about any similarities with this flow and your experience in publishing. You talked about ebook files.
Yeah,
what did that look like?
So everything I talked about actually started with my work with publishers. So I built that Microsoft Word-based toolchain that I showed an example of. I actually built that for Macmillan Publishers. It's their single source toolchain that they use for their content for a bunch of their books. When you're working with words that need to be turned into things, it's all really similar. The processes are all really similar. When you're reading a book, there are pieces of the book. A book is a document. There are ways that it needs to be presented to you, the user, that are exactly the same as the way documentation needs to be presented.
Mm-hmm. Susan's wondering if you use anything like code reviews to make sure writers are on track with using those labels correctly?
Yes.
Big nod.
There are many strategies for this. So sticking with the book publishing thing, what happens in that process is they actually have the copy editors do a full review of all the labels and make sure that they're correct. At Raspberry Pi, there is a dedicated documentation team that does all of the review from the content experts, the subject matter experts, to make sure that they are tagging their ASCII doc correctly. You can also automate a lot of this. So you can build in, again, like I said, it's all markup in the background, which means that you can build in linting tools and validation tools to make sure that everything is being used correctly. There's no unsupported labels being used or anything like that. And something that I did not talk about at all and kind of don't want to talk about a ton, but AI actually is a good tool for this. This is an extremely rule-based thing that's based on the meaning of text, and AI is getting a lot better at interpreting the meaning of text. So it's a great way to add either a first or a last pass onto this kind of thing. It should never, ever be the only thing that you do, though.
Love that last part. We've got two, hopefully quite quick questions left. Have you done anything with semantic content formatting, like the meaning of things like bold and italic?
That's a great question. Yes, but not a ton. So, like, in the context of bold and italic, yes, absolutely. HTML has built-in sort of strong versus bold, or emphasis versus italic. Strong and emphasis having more semantic meaning than just bold and italic. And similarly, with most of the tool chains I've built, I have what I call inline semantics, which are just that sort of thing. This is inline code. This is a key phrase. I haven't gone all the way down the rabbit hole of, person name, last name, place name, which is a whole other level of semantics that you could add that many people do add. But it tends to be overkill for the tool chains that I've worked on.
Yes, understandable. Last quick question, another person after my own heart. Can you tell us about this lovely cat who's been looking down at us?
Oh, this is Miss Cool. She was a Brooklyn street cat who followed one of my coworkers home one day, and they asked if anyone wanted to take her home, and I said yes, and she has been with me for about 9 years now.
Love it. Did you hear that? Oh. Well, we love you, Nellie. We love Miss Cool. Thank you so much for a great talk.